54. It is better to be an unhappy man than a happy pig. The utilitarians hoped by this golden bridge to get over the chasm which separates them from the promised land of the ideal. But psychology stepped in and rudely interrupted. There are no unhappy people, the unhappy ones are all pigs. Dostoevsky's philosopher of the underworld, Raskolnikov, also Hamlet, and such like, are not simply unhappy men whose fate might be esteemed, or even preferred before some happy fates. They are simply unhappy swine. And they themselves are principally aware of it. He that hath ears to hear, let him hear. 55. If you want people to envy you your sorrow or your shame, look as if you were proud of it. If you have only enough of the actor in you, rest assured you will become the hero of the day. Since the parable of the Pharisee and the publican was uttered, what a lot of people who could not fulfill their sacred duties pretended to be publicans and sinners, and so aroused sympathy, even envy. 56. Philosophers dearly love to call their utterances truths, since in that guise they become binding upon us all. But each philosopher invents his own truths, which means that he asks his pupils to deceive themselves in the way he shows, but that he reserves for himself the option of deceiving himself in his own way. Why? Why not allow everyone to deceive himself just as he likes? 57. When Xanthippe poured slops over Socrates as he returned from his philosophical occupations, tradition says that he observed, "After a storm there is always rain." Would it not be more worthy, not of the philosopher, but of philosophy, to say, "After one's philosophical exercise, one feels as if one had had slops emptied over one's head." And therefore Xanthippe did but give outward expression to what had taken place in Socrates' soul. Symbols are not always beautiful. 58. From the notes of an underworld man. I read little, I write little, and, it seems to me, I think little. He who is ill disposed towards me will say that this shows a great defect in my character. Perhaps he will call me lazy and Oblomov, and will repeat the copybook maxim that idleness is the mother of all the vices. A friend, on the other hand, will say it is only a temporary state, that perhaps I am not quite well. In short, he will find random excuses for me, more with the idea of consoling me than of speaking the truth. But for my part, I say let us wait. If it turns out at the end of my life that I have done not less than others, why then it will mean that idleness may be a virtue. 59. Bourne, a contemporary of Heine, was very much offended when his enemies insisted on explaining his misanthropic outpourings as the result of a stomach and liver disease. It seemed to him much nobler and loftier to be indignant and angry because of the triumph of evil on earth than because of the disorders of his own physical organs. Sentimentality apart, was he right? And is it really nobler? 60. A real writer disdains to repeat from hearsay events which he has not witnessed. It seems to him tedious and humiliating to tell in his own words, like a schoolboy, things which he has fished out of another man's books. But there, how can we expect him to stoop to such insignificance? 61. Whilst conscience stands between the educated and the lower classes as the only possible mediator, there can be no hope for mutual understanding. Conscience demands sacrifices, nothing but sacrifices. It says to the educated man, you are happy, well off, learned. The people are poor, unhappy, ignorant. Renounce, therefore, your well-being, or else soothe your conscience with suave speeches. Only he who has nothing to sacrifice, nothing to lose, having lost everything, can hope to approach the people as an equal. This is why Dostoevsky and Nietzsche were not afraid to speak in their own name, and did not feel compelled either to stretch up or to stoop down in order to be on a level with men. 62. Not to know what you want is considered a shameful weakness. To confess it is to lose forever not only the reputation of a writer, but even of a man. Nonetheless, conscience demands such a confession. True, in this case as in most others, The demands of conscience are satisfied only when they incur no very dire consequences. Leaving aside the fact that people are no longer terrified of the once so terrible public opinion, the public has been tamed, it listens with reverence to what is told to it, and never dares judge, the admission, "I do not know myself what I want," seems to offer a guarantee of something important. Those who know what they want generally want trifles, and attain to inglorious ends: riches, fame, or at the best, progress or a philosophy of their own. Even now it is sometimes not a sin to laugh at such wonders, and maybe the time is coming when a rehabilitated Hamlet will announce, not with shame but with pride, "I don't in the least know what I want." And the crowd will applaud him, for the crowd always applauds heroes and proud men. 63 Fear of death is explained conclusively by the desire for self-preservation. But at that rate the fear should disappear in old and sick people who ought by nature to look with indifference on death. Whereas the horror of death is present in all living things. Does not this suggest that there is still some other reason for the dread? And that even where the pangs of horror cannot save a man from his end, still it is a necessary and purposeful anguish. The natural scientific explanation here, as usual, stops halfway, and fails to lead the human mind to the promised goal. 64 Moral indignation is only a refined form of ancient vengeance. Once anger spoke with daggers, now words will do. And happy is the man who, loving and thirsting to chastise his offender, yet is appeased when the offence is punished. On account of the gratification it offers to the passions, morality which has replaced bloody chastisement will not easily lose its charm. But there are offences, deep, unforgettable offences, inflicted not by people but by laws of nature. How are we to settle these? Here neither dagger nor indignant word will serve. Therefore, for him who has once run foul of the laws of nature, morality sinks, for ever or for a time, into subsidiary importance. 65 Fatalism frightens people particularly in that form which holds it just to say, of anything that happens or has happened or will happen, "Be it so." How can one acquiesce in the actuality of life when it contains so many horrors? But amor fati does not imply eternal acquiescence in actuality. It is only a truce for a more or less lasting period. Time is needed in which to estimate the forces and intentions of the enemy. Under the mask of friendship the old enmity persists, and an awful revenge is in preparation. 66 In the ultimate questions of life we are not a bit nearer the truth than our ancestors were. Everybody knows it, and yet so many go on talking about infinity without any hope of ever saying anything. It is evident that a result in the usual acceptance of the word is not necessary. In the very last resort we trust to instinct, even in the field of philosophy, where reason is supposed to reign supreme, uttering its eternal why. Why laughs at all possible becauses. Instinct, however, does not mock. It simply ignores the whys, and leads us by impossible ways to ends that our divine reason would hold absurd if it could only see them in time. But reason is a laggard without much foresight, and therefore when we have run up to an unexpected conclusion, nothing remains but for reason to accept, or even to justify, to exalt the new event. And therefore reality is reasonable, say the philosophers. Reasonable, not only when they draw their philosophic salaries, as the socialists, and with them our philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, explain, but still reasonable even when philosophers have their maintenance taken away from them. Nay, in the latter case, particularly in the latter case, in spite of the socialists and Vladimir Solovyov, reality shows herself most reasonable. A philosopher persecuted, downtrodden, hungry, cold, receiving no salary, is nearly always an extreme fatalist, although this, of course, by no means hinders him from abusing the existing order. Theories of sequence and consequence, as we already know, are binding only upon disciples, whose single virtue lies in their scrupulous logical developing of the master's idea. But masters themselves invent ideas, and therefore have the right to substitute one for another. The sovereign power which proclaims a law has the same power to abolish it. But the duty of the subordinate consists in the praise, in the consequential interpretation, and the strict observance of the dictates of the higher will. 67. The Pharisee in the parable fulfilled all that religion demanded of him, kept his fasts, paid his tithes, etc. Had he a right to be pleased with his own piety, and to despise the erring publican? Everybody thought so, including the Pharisee himself. The judgment of Christ came as the greatest surprise to him. He had a clear conscience. He did not merely pretend before others to be righteous, he himself believed in his own righteousness. And suddenly he turns out guilty, awfully guilty. But if the conscience of a righteous man does not help him to distinguish between good and evil, how is he to avoid sin? What does Kant's moral law mean? That law which was as consoling as the starry sky. Kant lived his life in profound peace of soul, he met his death quietly in the consciousness of his own purity. But if Christ came again, he might condemn the serene philosopher for his very serenity. For the Pharisee, we repeat, was righteous, if purity of intentions, together with a firm readiness to fulfill everything which appears to him in the light of duty, be righteousness in a man. 68. We jeer and laugh at a man not because he is ridiculous, but because we want to have a laugh out of him. In the same way we are indignant, not because this or the other act is revolting to us, but because we want to let off our steam. But it does not follow from this that we ought always to be calm and smooth. Woe to him who would try to realize the ideal of justice on earth. 69. We think with peculiar intensity during the hard moments of our life. We write when we have nothing else to do. So that a writer can only communicate something of importance in reproducing the past. When we are driven to think, we have unfortunately no mind to write, which accounts for the fact that books are never more than a feeble echo of what a man has gone through. 70. Tchekhov has a story called Misfortune, which well illustrates the difficulty a man finds in adapting himself to a new truth, if this truth threaten the security of his condition. The merchant Avdyer does not believe that he is condemned, that he has been brought to trial and tried and found guilty for his irregularities in a public bank. He still thinks the verdict is yet to come, he still waits. In the world of learning, something like this is happening. The educated have become so accustomed to think themselves not guilty, perfectly in the right, that they do not admit for a moment even now that they are brought to court. When threatening voices reach them, calling them to give an account of themselves, they only suspiciously shrug their shoulders. All this will pass away, they think. Well, when at last they are convinced that misfortune has befallen them, they will probably begin to justify themselves like Avdyer, declaring that they cannot even read printed matter sufficiently well. As yet, they pass for respectable, wise, experienced, omniscient men. 71. If a man had come to Dostoevsky and said to him, "I am hopelessly unhappy," the great artist in human misery would probably, at the bottom of his soul, have laughed at the naivete of the poor creature. May one confess such things of oneself? May one go to such lengths of complaint, and still expect consolation from his neighbour? Hopelessness is the most solemn and supreme moment in life. Till that point we have been assisted, now we are left to ourselves. Previously we had to do with men and human laws, now with eternity and with the complete absence of laws. Is it not obvious? 72. Byelinsky, in his famous letter, accuses Gogol, among other things, that in his correspondence with friends he, Gogol, succumbs to the fear of death, of devils, and of hell. I find the accusation just. Gogol definitely feared death, demons, and hell. The point is whether it is not right to fear these things, and whether fearlessness would be a proof of the high development of a man's soul. Schopenhauer asserts that death inspired philosophy. All the best poetry, all the wonderful mythology of the ancients and of modern peoples have for their source the fear of death. Only modern science forbids men to fear, and insists on a tranquil attitude towards death. So we arrive at utilitarianism and the positivist philosophy. If you wish to be rid of both these creeds, you must be allowed to think again of death, and without shame to fear hell and its devils. It may be there is really a certain justification for concealing fears of such kind. In the ability to conceal one's agitation at moments of great danger, there is a true beauty. But to deaden human sensitiveness, and to keep the human intelligence within the bounds of perception, such a task can have charms only for a petty creature. Happily, mankind has no means by which to perform on itself such monstrous castration. Persecuted Eros, it is true, has hidden himself from the eyes of his enemies, but he has never abjured himself, and even the strictest medieval monks could not completely tear out their hearts from their breasts. Similarly with the aspiration towards the infinite. Science persecuted it and put a veto on it. But laboratory workers themselves, sooner or later, recover their senses, and thirstily long to get out of the enclosure of positive knowledge, with that same thirsty longing that tortured the monks who wanted to get out of the enclosure of monastery walls. 73. If fate, and they say there is such a law, punishes criminals, it has its penalty also for the lovers of good. The former it throttles, the latter it spits upon. The former end in bitter torment, the latter in ignominy. 74. Philosophy has always loved to occupy the position of a servant. In the Middle Ages she was the ancilla theologiae, nowadays she waits on science. At the same time she calls herself the science of sciences. 75. I wonder which more effectually makes a man rush forwards without looking back: the knowledge that behind him hovers the head of Medusa with horrible snakes ready to turn him into stone, or the certainty that in the rear lies the unchangeable order laid down by the law of causality and by modern science. Judging from what we see, judging from the degree of tension which human thought has reached today, it would seem that the head of Medusa is less terrible than the law of causality. In order to escape the latter, man will face anything. Rather than return to the bosom of scientific cause and effect, he embraces madness. Not that fine frenzy of madness which spends itself in fiery speeches, but technical madness, for which one is stowed away in a lunatic asylum. 76. To experience a feeling of joy or sorrow, of triumph or despair, ennui or happiness, and so on, without having sufficient cause for such feeling, is an unfailing sign of mental disease. One of the modern truths which is seeing its last days. Section 77. Count Tolstoy's German biographer regrets the constant misunderstanding and quarrels which took place between Tolstoy and Turgenev. He reminds us of Goethe and Schiller, and thinks that Russian literature would have gained a great deal if the two remarkable Russian writers had been more pacific, had remained on constantly friendly terms with one another, and bequeathed to posterity a couple of volumes of letters dealing with literary and philosophic subjects. It might have been very nice, but I refuse to imagine Tolstoy and Turgenev keeping up a long, peaceful correspondence, particularly on high subjects. Nearly every one of Turgenev's opinions drove Tolstoy to madness, or was capable of so driving him. Dostoevsky's dislike of Turgenev was even stronger than Tolstoy's. He wrote of him very spitefully and offensively, libeling him rather than drawing a caricature. Evidently Dostoevsky, like Tolstoy, detested the European in their confrère. But here he was mistaken, in spite of his psychological acuteness. To Dostoevsky it was enough that Turgenev wore European clothes and tried to appear like a Westerner. He himself did the opposite. He tried to get rid of every trace of Europeanism from himself, apparently without great success, since he failed to make clear to himself wherein lay the strength of Europe and where her sting. Nevertheless, the late Mikhailovsky is not wrong in calling Dostoevsky a seeker of buried treasure. Surely, in the second half of his literary activity, Dostoevsky no longer sought for the real fruits of life. There awoke in him the Russian, the elemental man, with a thirst for the miraculous. Compared with what he wanted, The fruits of European civilization seemed to him trivial, flat, insipid. The age‐long civilization of his neighbours told him that there never had been a miracle and never would be. But all his being, not yet broken in by civilization, craved for the stupendous unknown. Therefore the apparently satisfied progressivist enraged him. Tolstoy once said of Turgenev, "I hate his democratic backside." Dostoevsky might have repeated these words. And now, for the gratification of the German critic, please reconcile the Russian writers and make them talk serenely on high-flown matters. Dostoevsky was within a hair's breadth of a quarrel with Tolstoy, with whom, not long before death interrupted him, he began a long controversy concerning Anna Karenina. Even Tolstoy seemed to him too compliant, too accommodating. 78. We rarely make a display of that which is dear to us, near and dear and necessary. On the other hand, we readily exhibit that which is of no importance to us, there is nothing else to be done with it. A man takes his mistress to the theatre and sticks her in full view of everybody. He prefers to remain at home with the woman he loves, or to go about with her quietly, unnoticed. So with our virtues. Every time we notice in ourselves some quality we do not prize, we haste to make a show of it, thinking perhaps that someone would be glad of it. If it wins us approval, we are pleased, so there is some gain. To an actor, a writer, or an orator, his own antics, without which he can have no success with the public, are often disgusting. And yet his knack of making such antics he considers a talent, a divine gift, and he would rather die than that it should be lost to the public. Talent, on the whole, is accounted a divine gift only because it is always on show, because it serves the public in some way or other. All our judgments are permeated through and through with utilitarianism, and were we to attempt to purify them from this adulteration, what would remain of modern philosophy? That is why youngish, inexperienced writers usually believe in harmonia praestabilitata, even though they have never heard of Leibniz. They persuade themselves that there is no breach between egoistic and idealistic aspirations. That, for instance, thirst for fame and desire to serve mankind are one and the same thing. Such a persuasion is usually very tenacious of life, and lasts long in men of vigorous and courageous mind. It seems to me that Pushkin would not have lost it, even had he lived to a prolonged old age. It was also part of Turgenev's belief, if a man of his spiritual fibre could have any belief. Tolstoy now believed and now disbelieved, according to the work he had in hand. When he had other people's ideas to destroy, he doubted the identity of egoistic and idealistic aspirations. When he had his own to defend, he believed in it. Which is a line of conduct worthy of attention and supremely worthy of imitation. For human truths are proper exclusively for ancillary purposes. 79. Man is such a conservative creature that any change, even a change for the better, scares him. He prefers the bad old way to the new good one. A man who has been all his life a confirmed materialist would not consent to believe that the soul was immortal, not if it were proved to him more geometrico, and not if he were a constitutional coward, fearing death like Shakespeare's Falstaff. Then we must take human conceit into account. Men do not like to admit themselves wrong. It is absurd, but it is so. Men, trivial, wretched creatures, proved by history and by every common event to be bunglers, yet must needs consider themselves infallible, omniscient. What for? Why not admit their ignorance flatly and frankly? True, it is easier said than done. But why should slavish intellect, in spite of our desire to be straightforward, deck us out with would-be truths, of which we cannot divest ourselves even when we know their flimsiness? Socrates wanted to think that he knew nothing, but he could not bring it off. He most absorbedly believed in his own knowledge. Nothing could be truth except his teaching. He accepted the decree of the oracle, and sincerely esteemed himself the wisest of men. And so it will be as long as philosophers feel it their duty to teach and to save their neighbours. If a man wants to help people, he is bound to become a liar. We should undertake doubt seriously, not in order to return at length to established beliefs, for that would be a vicious circle. Experience shows us that such a process, certainly in the development of ultimate questions, only leads from error to error. We should doubt, so that doubt becomes a continuous creative force, inspiring the very essence of our life. For established knowledge argues in us a condition of imperfect receptivity. The weak, flabby spirit cannot bear quick, ceaseless change. It must look round, it must have time to gather its wits, and so it must undergo the same experience time after time. It needs the support and the security of habit. But the well-grown soul despises your crutches. He is tired of crawling on his own cabbage patch, he tears himself away from his own native soil and takes himself off into the far distances, braving the infinitude of space. Surely everybody knows we are not to live in the world for ever. But cowardice prevents one straightforward admitting of it. We keep it close till there is an occasion to air it as a truism. Only when misfortune, disease, old age come upon us, then the dread fear of departure walks with us like our own skeleton. We cannot dismiss him. At length, involuntarily, we begin to examine our gruesome companion with curiosity. And then, strangely enough, we observe that he not only tortures us, but, keeping pace with us, he has begun to gnaw through all the threads that bind us to the old existence. At moments it seems as if, a few more threads gone, nothing will remain to hold us back. The eternal dream of crawling man will be fulfilled. We shall be released from the bonds, we shall betake ourselves in liberty to regions far from this damned vale of earth. 80. Moralists are abused because they offer us moral consolations. This is not quite fair. Moralists would joyfully substitute palpable blessings for their abstract gifts, if they could. When he was young, Tolstoy wanted to make men happy. When he was old, and knew he could not make them happy, he began to preach renunciation, resignation, and so forth. And how angry he got when people wouldn't have his teaching. But if, instead of foisting his doctrines off on us as the solution of the ultimate problems, and as optimism, he had only spoken of the impossibility of finding satisfactory answers, and have offered himself as a pessimist, he would probably have obtained a much more willing hearing. Now he is annoying. Because, finding himself unable to relieve his neighbours, he turns to them and insists that they shall consider themselves relieved by him, nay, even made happy by him. To which many will not agree, for why should they voluntarily renounce their rights? Since although, God knows, the right of quarrelling with one's fate and cursing it is not a very grand right, still it is a right. 81. Ivanov, in Tchekhov's drama of that name, compares himself to an overstrained labourer. The labourer dies so that all that remains to Ivanov is to die. But logic, as you know, recommends great caution in coming to conclusions by analogy. Behold Tchekhov himself, who, as far as we can judge, had endured in his own soul all the tragedy, just as Ivanov had, did not die or think of dying, or even turn out a wasted man. He is doing something, he struggles, he seeks, his work seems important and considerable to us, just like other human beings. Ivanov shot himself because the drama must end, while Tchekhov had not yet finished his own struggle. Our aesthetics demand that the drama must have a climax and a finale, though we have abandoned the Aristotelian unities. Given a little more time, however, dramatic writers will have got rid of this restriction also. They will frankly confess that they do not know how, or with what event, to end their dramas. Stories have already learnt to dispense with an ending. 82. More of the same. Ivanov says, now, where is my salvation? In what? If an intelligent, educated, healthy man, for no discoverable reason, sets up a Lazarus lament and starts to roll down an inclined plane, then he is rolling without resisting, and there is no salvation for him. One way out would be to accept the inclined plane and the gathering impetus as normal. Even further, one might find in the rolling descent a proof of one's spiritual superiority to other men. Of course in such a case one should go apart from the rest, not court young girls, or fraternize with those who are living the ordinary life, but be alone. Love is nonsense, caress is maudlin, work is meaningless, and song and fiery speeches are banal, played out," continued Ivanov. To young Sasha these words are horrible, but Ivanov will be responsible for them. He is already responsible for them. That he is tottering is nothing, it is still full early for him to shoot himself. He will live whilst his creator Tchekov lives, and we shall listen to the shaky, vacillating philosophy. We are so sick of symmetry and harmony and finality, sick as we are of bourgeois self-complacency. 83 It will be seen from the above that already in Ivanov, one of his early works, Tchekov has assumed the role of advocatus diaboli. Wherever Ivanov appears he brings ruin and destruction. It is true, Tchekov hesitates to take his side openly, and evidently does not know what to do with his hero, so that in the end he shakes him off, so to speak, he washes his hands of him in the accepted fashion. Ivanov shoots himself in the sight of everybody, has not even time to go discreetly into a corner. The only justification of Ivanov is that caricature of honesty, Dr. Lvov. Lvov is not a living figure, that is obvious. But this is why he is remarkable. It is remarkable that Tchekov should deem it necessary to resurrect the forgotten Starodoum, that utterer of truisms, in von Wiesen's comedy, and to resurrect him no longer that people may bow their heads before the incarnation of virtue, but so that they shall jeer at him. Look at Dr. Lvov. Is he not Starodoum alive again? He is honesty personified. From force of old habit, honesty sticks his chest out, and speaks in a loud voice with imperious tone, and yet not one of his old loyal subjects gives a brass farthing for him. They don't even trouble to gibe at him, but spit on him and shove him through the door as a disgusting and impudent toady. Poor honesty, what has he sunk to? Evidently virtues, like everything else, should not live too long on earth. Tchekov's Uncle Vanya is waiting to throw himself on the neck of his friend and rival, the doctor, throw himself on his neck and sob there like a little child. But he finds that the doctor himself has an unquenchable thirst for consolation and encouragement, whilst poor Sonia can bear her maiden sorrows no longer. They all go wandering round with big lost eyes, looking for someone to relieve them from part of their woes at least. And lo, everybody is in the same street as themselves. All are over heavy laden, not one can carry his own burden, let alone give a lift to another's. The last consolation is taken away. It is no use complaining, there is no sympathetic response. On all faces the same expression of hopelessness and despair. Each must bear his cross in silence. None may weep nor utter pitiful cries. It would be uncalled for and indecent. When Uncle Vanya, who has not realized at once the extremity of his situation, begins to cry out, "My life's a waste," nobody wants to listen to him. Waste, waste! Everybody knows it's a waste. Shut your mouth. Howling won't help you. Neither will pistol shots solve anything. Every one of us might start your cry, but we don't. Neither do we shout, "You think I'll weep? No, I'll not weep. I have full cause of weeping. But this heart shall break into 100,000 flaws, or ere I'll weep, O fool, I shall go mad." Gradually there settles down a dreadful, eternal silence of the cemetery. All go mad without words. They realize what is happening within them, and make up their minds for the last shift. To hide their grief forever from men, and to speak in commonplace trivial words which will be accepted as sensible, serious, and even lofty expressions. No longer will anyone cry, "Life is a waste," and intrude his feelings on his neighbours. Everybody knows that it is shameful for one's life to be a waste, and that this shame should be hidden from every eye. The last law on earth is loneliness. Resign yourself, O my heart, sleep the sleep of the brute. 85 Groundless assumptions. Based on nothing, because they seem to derive from common assumption of the reasonableness of human existence, which assumption surely is the child of our desires, and probably a bastard at that. In his Miserly Night, Pushkin represented a miser as a romantic figure. Gogol, with his Plyushkin, creates, on the contrary, a repulsive figure of a miser. Gogol was nearer to reality. A miser is ugly, whatever view you take of him, inward or outward. Yet Gogol ought not to teach people to preserve in their age the ideals of their youth. Once old age is upon us, it must not be improved upon, much less apologized for. It must be accepted and its essence brought to light. Plyushkin, the vulgar, dirty maniac, is disgusting. But who knows, perhaps he is fulfilling the serious mission of his own being. He is possessed by one desire: to everything else, to all happenings in the outer world, he is indifferent. It is the same to him whether he is hungry or full, warm or cold, clean or dirty. Practically no event can distract his attention from his single purpose. He is disinterestedly mean, if one may say so. He has no need for his riches. He lets them rot in a disgusting heap, and does not dream, like Pushkin's knight, of palaces and power, or of sportive nymphs. Upon what end is he concentrated? No one has the time to think it out. At the sight of Plyushkin, every one recalls the damage the miser has done. Every one, of course, is right. Plyushkins, who heap up fortunes to let them rot, are very harmful. The social judgment is nearly always to the point. But not quite always. It won't hurt morals and social considerations if at times they have to hold their tongue. And at such times we might succeed in guessing the riddle of meanness, sordidness, old age. Section 86. We have sufficient grounds for taking life mistrustfully. It has defrauded us so often of our cherished expectations. But we have still stronger reasons for mistrusting reason, since if life deceived us, it was only because futile reason let herself be deceived. Perhaps reason herself invented the deception, and then, to serve her own ambitious ends, threw the blame on life, so that life shall appear sick-headed. But if we have to choose between life and reason, we choose life. And then we no longer need try to foresee and to explain, we can wait, and accept all that is unalterable as part of the game. And thus Nietzsche, having realized that all his hopes had gradually crumbled, and that he could never get back to his former strength, but must grow worse and worse every day, wrote in a private letter of May 28th, 1883, Ich will es so schwer haben, wie nur irgend ein Mensch es hat. Erst unter diesem Drucke gewinnen ich das gute Gewissen dafür, etwas zu besitzen, das wenige Menschen haben und gehabt haben, Flügel, in Gleichnisse zu reden. In these few simple words lies the key to the philosophy of Nietzsche. 87. So long as Apollo calls him not to the sacred offering, of all the trifling children of men, the most trifling, perhaps, is the poet. Put Pushkin's expression into plain language, and you will get a page on neuropathology. All neurasthenic individuals sink from a state of extreme excitation to one of complete prostration. Poets, too, and they are proud of it. 88. Shy people usually receive their impressions post-dated. During those moments when an event is taking place before their eyes, they can see nothing. Only later on, having evoked from their memory a fragment of what happened, they make for themselves an impression of the whole scene. And then, retrospectively arise in their soul feelings of pity, offense, surprise, so vivid as if they were the flames of the instant moment, not rekindlings from the past. Thus shy people always think a great deal, and are always too late for their work. It is never too late for thought. Timid before others, they reach great heights of daring when alone. They are bad speakers, but often excellent writers. Their life is insignificant and tedious, they are not noticed, until they become famous. And by the time fame comes, they do not need popular attention any more. 89. If Chekhov's Laevsky, in The Duel, had been a writer with a literary talent, people would have said of him that he was original, and that he was engaged in the study of the mysticism of sex, like Gabriele D'Annunzio, for example. whereas as he stands he is only banal. His idleness is a reproach to him. People would prefer that at least he should copy out extracts from documents. 90. From Observations on Children. Egoism in a man strikes us unpleasantly because it betrays our poverty. I cannot dole out my abundance to my neighbours, for if I do, I myself shall be left with little. We should like to be able to scatter riches with a royal hand, and therefore when we see someone else clutching his rags with the phrase, property is sacred, we are hurt. What is sacred comes from the gods, and the gods have plenty of everything. They do not count and skimp like mortals. 91. We see a man repent for his actions, and conclude that such actions should be avoided. An instance of false but apparently irreproachable reasoning. Time passes, and we see the same man repenting again of the self-same acts. If we love logic, this will confirm us in our first conclusion. But if we do not care for logic, we shall say, man is under an equal necessity to commit these acts and to repent of them. Sometimes, however, the first conclusion is corrected differently. Having decided that repentance proves that a certain course of action should be avoided, man avoids it all his life, only to realize in the end suddenly, with extraordinary clarity, how bitter is his regret that he has not trodden the forbidden course. But by this time a new conclusion is already useless. Life is over, and the newly enlightened mind no longer knows how to rid itself of the superfluous light. 92. A version of one of the scenes of Tolstoy's Power of Darkness reminds us exactly of a one-act piece of Maeterlinck. There can be no question of imitation. When The Power of Darkness was written, nobody had heard of Maeterlinck. Tolstoy evidently wanted to try a new method of creating, and to get rid of his own manner, which he had evolved through tens of years of dogged labour. But the risk was too great. He preferred to cure himself of his doubts by the common expedient, manual toil and an outdoor life. So he took up the plough. 93. Every woodcock praises its own fen. Lermontov saw the sign of spiritual pre-eminence in dazzling white linen, and therefore his heroes always dressed with taste. Dostoevsky, on the other hand, despised show. Dmitry Karamazov wears dirty linen, and this is assigned to him as a merit, or almost a merit. 94. While he was yet young, when he wrote his story Enough, Turgenev saw that something terrible hung over his life. He saw, but did not get frightened, although he understood that in time he ought to become frightened, because life without a continual inner disturbance would have no meaning for him. 95. Napoleon is reputed to have had a profound insight into the human soul. Shakespeare also. And their vision has nothing in common. 96. What we call imagination, which we value so highly in great poets, is essentially unbridled, loose, or, if you will, even perverted mentality. In ordinary mortals we call it vice, but to the poets everything is forgiven on account of the benefit and pleasure we derive from their works. In spite of our high-flown theories, we have always been extremely practical, great utilitarians. 2,500 years went by before Tolstoy got up and, in his turn, offered the poets their choice, either to be virtuous or to stop creating and forfeit the fame of teachers. If Tolstoy did not make a laughing-stock of himself, he has to thank his grey hairs and the respect which was felt for his past. Anyhow, nobody took him seriously. Far from it. For never yet did poets feel so free from the shackles of morality as they do now. If Schiller were writing his dramas and philosophic essays today, he would scarcely find a reader. In Tolstoy himself, it is not so much his virtues as his vices which we find interesting. We begin to understand his works not so much in the light of his striving after ideals, but from the standpoint of that incongruity which existed between the ideas he artificially imposed upon himself and the demands of his own non-virtuous soul, which struggled ever for liberty. Nikolenka Irtenyov, in childhood and youth, would sit for hours on the terrace, turning over in his mind his elder brother Volodya's love making with the chambermaids. But although he desired it more than anything on earth, he could never bring himself to be like Volodya. The maid said to the elder brother, "Why doesn't Nikolai Petrovitch ever come here and have a lark?" She did not know that Nikolai Petrovitch was sitting at that moment under the stairs, ready to give anything on earth to take the place of the scamp Volodya. Everything on earth is twice repeated. Tolstoy gives a psychological explanation of his little hero's conduct. "I was timid by nature," Nikolenka tells us, "but my shyness was increased by the conviction of my ugliness." Ugliness, the consciousness of one's ugliness, leads to shyness. What good can there be in virtue which has such a suspicious origin? And how can the morality of Tolstoy's heroes be trusted? Consciousness of one's ugliness begets shyness. Shyness drives the passions inwards and allows them no natural outlet. Little by little there develops a monstrous discrepancy between the imagination and its desires on the one hand, and the power to satisfy these desires on the other. Permanent hunger and a contracted alimentary canal which does not pass the food through. Hence the hatred of the imagination with its unrealized and unrealizable cravings. In our day no one has scourged love so cruelly as Tolstoy in Power of Darkness. But the feats of the village Don Juan need not necessarily end in tragedy. More than anything on earth, however, Tolstoy hates the Don Juans, the handsome, brave, successful, the self-confident, who spontaneously act upon suggestion, the conquerors of women, who stretch out their hands to living statues cold as stone. As far as ever he can, he has his revenge on them in his writing. 97. In the drama of the future, the whole presentation will be different. First of all, the difficulties of the dénouement will be set aside. The new hero has a past, reminiscent but no present. Neither wife nor sweetheart nor friends nor occupation. He is alone, he communes only with himself or with imaginary listeners. He lives a life apart, so that the stage will represent either a desert island or a room in a large densely populated city where among millions of inhabitants one can live alone as on a desert island. The hero must not return to people and to social ideals, he must go forward to loneliness, to absolute loneliness. Even now nobody, looking at Gogol's Plyushkin, will feel any more the slightest response to the pathetic appeal for men to preserve the ideals of youth on into old age. Modern youths go to see Plyushkin, not for the sake of laughing at him, or of benefiting from the warning which his terrible miserly figure offers them, but in order to see if there may not be some few little pearls there where they could be least expected, in the midst of his heap of dirt. Lycurgus succeeded in fixing the Spartans like cement for some centuries, but after that came the thaw, and all their hardness melted. The last remains of the petrified Doric art are now removed to museums. Is something happening? 98. If I sow not in the spring, in autumn I shall eat no bread. Every day brings troubles and worries enough for poor weak man. He had to forget his work for a moment, and now he is lost. He will die of hunger or cold. In order merely to preserve our existence, we have to strain mind and body to the utmost. Nay, more, we have to think of the surrounding world exclusively with a view to gaining a livelihood from it. There is no time to think about truth. This is why positivism was invented, with its theory of natural development. Really, everything we see is mysterious and incomprehensible. A tiny midge and a huge elephant, a caressing breeze and a blizzard, a young tree and a rocky mountain — what are all these? What are they? Why are they? We incessantly ask ourselves, but we may not speak out. For philosophy is ever pushed aside to make room for the daily needs. Only those who think, who are unable to trouble about self-preservation, or who will not trouble, or who are too careless, that is, sick, desperate, or lazy people. These return to the riddle which work-a-day men, confirmed in the certainty that they are right, have construed into naturalness. 99. Kant, and after him Schopenhauer, was exceedingly fond of the epithet disinterested, and used it on every occasion when the supply of laudatory terms he had at his disposal was exhausted. Disinterested thinking, which does not pursue any practical aim, is, according to Schopenhauer, the highest ideal towards which man can strive. This truth he considered universal and a priori. But had he chanced to be brought amongst Russian peasants, he would have had to change his opinion. With them, thoughts about destiny, and the why and wherefore of the universe, and infinity, and so on, would by no means be considered disinterested, particularly if the man who devoted himself to such thoughts were at the same time to announce, as becomes a philosopher, that he claimed complete freedom from physical labour. There the philosopher, were he even Plato, would be stigmatized with the disgraceful nickname Idle Jack. There the highest activity is interested activity, directed towards strictly practical purposes. And if the peasants could speak learnedly, they would certainly call the principle upon which their judgment is founded an a priori. Tolstoy, who draws his wisdom from the folk sources, attacks the learned for the very fact that they do not want to work, but are disinterestedly occupied in the search for truth. 100. It is clear to any impartial observer that practically every man changes his opinion 10 times a day. Much has been said on this subject. It has served for innumerable satires and humorous sketches. Nobody has ever doubted that it was a vice to be unstable in one's opinions. 3/4 of our education goes to teaching us most carefully to conceal within ourselves the changeableness of our moods and judgments. A man who cannot keep his word is the last of men, never to be trusted. Likewise a man with no firm convictions. It is impossible to work together with him. Morality, here as always making towards utilitarian ends, issues the eternal principle: thou shalt remain true to thy convictions. In cultured circles this commandment is considered so unimpeachable that men are terrified even to appear inconstant in their own eyes. They become petrified in their beliefs, and no greater shame can happen to them than that they should be forced to admit that they have altered in their convictions. When a straightforward man like Montaigne plainly speaks of the inconstancy of his mind and his views, he is regarded as a libeller of himself. One need neither see, nor hear, nor understand what is taking place around one. Once your mind is made up, you have lost your right to grow, you must remain a stock, a statue, the qualities and defects of which are known to everybody. 101. Every philosophic world conception starts from some or other solution of the general problem of human existence, and proceeds from this to direct the course of human life in some particular direction or other. We have neither the power nor the data for the solution of general problems, and consequently all our moral deductions are arbitrary, the only witness to our prejudices if we are naturally timid, or to our propensities and tastes if we are self-confident. But to keep up prejudices is a miserable, unworthy business. Nobody will dispute that. Therefore, let us cease to grieve about our differences in opinion, let us wish that in the future there should be many more differences, and much less unanimity. There is no arbitrary truth. It remains to suppose that truth lies in changeable human tastes and desires. In so far as our common social existence demands it, let us try to come to an understanding, to agree, but not one jot more. Any agreement which does not arise out of common necessity will be a crime against the Holy Spirit. 102. Tchekhov was very good at expounding a system of philosophy, even several systems. We have examples in more than one of his stories, particularly in The Duel, where Von Koren speaks ex cathedra. But Tchekhov had no use for such systems, save for purely literary purposes. When you write a story, and your hero must speak clearly and consistently, a system has its value. But when you are left to yourself, can you seriously trouble your soul about philosophy? Even a German cannot, it seems, go so far in his idealism. Vladimir Semyonovitch, the young author in Tchekhov's Nice People, sincerely and deeply believes in his own ideas, but even of him, notwithstanding his blatantly comical limitations, we cannot say more than that his ideas were constant little views or pictures to him, which had gradually become a second natural setting to everything he saw. Certainly he did not live by ideas. Tchekov is right when he said that the singing of Gaudeamus Igitur and the writing of a humanitarian appeal were equally important to Vladimir Semyonovitch. As soon as Vladimir's sister begins to think for herself, her brother's highest ideas, which she has formerly revered, become banal and objectionable to her. Her brother cannot understand her, neither her hostility to progress and humanitarianism, nor to the university spree and Gaudeamus Igitur. But Tchekov does understand. Only let us admit the word understand does not carry its ordinary meaning here. So long as the child was fed on its mother's milk, everything seemed to it smooth and easy. But when it had to give up milk and take to vodka, and this is the inevitable law of human development, the childish suckling dreams receded into the realm of the irretrievable past. Section 103. The summit of human existence, say the philosophers, is spiritual serenity, aequanimitas. But in that case the animals should be our ideal, for in the matter of imperturbability they leave nothing to be desired. Look at a grazing sheep or a cow. They do not look before and after, and sigh for what is not. Given a good pasture, the present suffices them perfectly. 104. A hungry man was given a piece of bread and a kind word. The kindness seemed more to him than the bread. But had he been given only the kind word and no bread, he would perhaps have hated nice phrases. Therefore caution is always to be recommended in the drawing of conclusions, and in none more than in the conclusion that truth is more urgently required than a consoling lie. The connections of isolated phenomena can very rarely be discerned. As a rule, several causes at once produce one effect. Owing to our propensity for idealizing, we always make prominent that cause which seems to us loftiest. 105. A strange anomaly. We see thousands of human beings perish around us, yet we walk warily lest we crush a worm. The sense of compassion is strong in us, but it is adapted to the conditions of our existence. It can relieve an odd case here and there, and it raises a terrific outcry over a trifling injustice. Yet Schopenhauer wanted to make compassion the metaphysical basis of morality. 106. To discard logic as an instrument, a means or aid for acquiring knowledge, would be extravagant. Why should we? For the sake of consequentialism, that is, for logic's very self? But logic, as an aim in itself, or even as the only means to knowledge, is a different matter. Against this one must fight, even if he has against him all the authorities of thought, beginning with Aristotle. 107. When the yellowing cornfields sway and are moved, and the fresh forest utters sound to the breeze, then I see happiness on earth and God in heaven. It may be so to the poet, but it may be quite different. Sometimes the cornfield waves, the woods make noise in the wind, the stream whispers its best tales, and still man cannot perceive happiness, nor forget the lesson taught in childhood that the blue heavens are only an optical illusion. But if the sky and the boundless fields do not convince, is it possible that the arguments of Kant and the commentations of his dozens of talentless followers can do anything? 108. The greatest temptation. In Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor lurks a dreadful idea. Who can be sure, he says, metaphorically of course, that when the crucified Christ uttered his cry, "Lord, why hast thou forsaken me?" he did not call to mind the temptation of Satan, who for one word had offered him dominion over the world? And, if Jesus recollected this offer, how can we be sure that he did not repent not having taken it? One had better not be told about such temptations. 109. From the Future Opinions Concerning Contemporary Europe. Europe of the 19th and 20th centuries presented a strange picture. After Luther, Christianity degenerated into morality, and all the threads connecting man with God were cut. Together with the rationalization of religion, all life took on a flat, rational character. Knights were replaced by a standing army, recruited on the principle of compulsory military service for all, and existing chiefly for the purpose of parades and official needs. Alchemy, which had been trying to find the philosopher's stone, was replaced by chemistry, which tried to discover the best means for cheap preparation of cheap commodities. Astrology, which had sought in the stars the destinies of men, was replaced by astronomy, which foretold the eclipses of the sun and the appearing of comets. Even the dress of the people became strangely colorless. Not only men, but women also, wore uniform monochromatic clothes. Most remarkable of all, that epoch did not notice its own significance, but was even proud of itself. It seemed to the man of that day that never before had the common treasury of spiritual riches been so well replenished. We, of course, may smile at their naivete, but if one of their own number had allowed himself to express an opinion disdainful of the bases of the contemporary culture, he would have been declared immoral, or put away in a madhouse. A terrible punishment very common in that coarse period, though now it is very difficult even to imagine what such a proceeding implied. But in those days to be known as immoral, or to find oneself in a madhouse, was worse than to die. One of the famous poets of the 19th century, Alexander Pushkin, said, "God forbid that I should go mad. Rather let me be a starving beggar." In those times people on the whole were compelled to tell lies and play the hypocrite, so that not infrequently the brightest minds, who saw through the shams of their epoch, yet pretended to believe in science and morality, only in order to escape the persecution of public opinion. 110. Writers of tragedies on Shakespeare's model. To obtain a spark, one must strike with all one's might with an iron upon a stone, whereupon there is a loud noise, which many are inclined to believe more important than the little spark. Similarly, writers having shouted very loudly, are deeply assured that they have fulfilled their sacred mission, and are amazed that all do not share their raptures, that some even stop their ears and run away. 111. Metamorphoses. Sense and folly are not at all native qualities in a man. In a crisis a stupid man becomes clever. We need not go far for an example. What a gaping simpleton Dostoevsky looks in his Injured and Insulted, not to mention Poor Folk. But in Letters from the Underworld and the rest of his books he is the shrewdest and cleverest of writers. The same may be said of Nietzsche, Tolstoy, or Shakespeare. In his Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche seems just like the ordinary, honest, rather simple, blue-eyed provincial German student, and in Zarathustra he reminds one of Machiavelli. Poor Shakespeare got himself into a row for his Brutus, but no man could deny the great mind in Hamlet. The best instance of all, however, is Tolstoy. Right up to today, whenever he likes he can be cleverer than the cleverest. Yet at times he is a schoolboy. This is the most interesting and enviable trait in him. 112. In Troilus and Cressida, Thersites says, "Shall the elephant Ajax carry it thus? He beats me, and I rail at him. O worthy satisfaction! Would it were otherwise, that I could beat him whilst he railed at me." Dostoevsky might have said the same of his opponents. He pursued them with stings, sarcasm, abuse, and they drove him to a white heat by their quiet assurance and composure. The present day admirers of Dostoevsky quietly believe in the teachings of their master. Does it not mean that de facto they have betrayed him and gone over to the side of his enemies? 113. The opinion has gained ground that Turgenev's ideal women, Natalie, Elena, Marianna, are created in the image and likeness of Pushkin's Tatyana. The critics have been misled by external appearances. To Pushkin His Tatyana appears as a vestal guarding the sacred flame of high morality, because such a job is not fitting for a male. The pretender in Boris Godunov says to the old monk Pimen, who preaches meekness and submission: "But you fought under the walls of Kazan, etc." That is a man's work. But in the hours of peace and leisure the fighter needs his own hearthside. He must feel assured that at home his rights are safely guarded. This is the point of Tatyana's last words: "I belong to another, and shall remain forever true to him." But in Turgenev woman appears as the judge and the reward, sometimes even the inspirer of victorious man. There is a great difference. 114. From a German Introduction to Philosophy. We shall maintain the opinion that metaphysics, as the crown of the particular sciences, is possible and desirable, and that to it falls the task intermediate between theory and practice, experiment and anticipation, mind and feeling, the task of weighing probabilities, balancing arguments, and reconciling difficulties. Thus metaphysics is a weighing of probabilities. Ergo, further than probable conclusions it cannot go. Thus why do metaphysicians pretend to universal and obligatory, established and eternal judgments? They go beyond themselves. In the domain of metaphysics there cannot and must not be any established beliefs. The word established loses all its sense in the connection. It is reasonable to speak of eternal hesitation and temporality of thought. 115. From another Introduction to Philosophy, also German. Compared with the delusion of the materialists, the wretchedest worshipper of idols seems to us a being capable of apprehending to a certain degree the great meaning and essence of things. Perhaps this thought strayed in accidentally among the huge herd of the other thoughts of the professor, so little does it resemble the rest. But even so it loses none of its interest. If the materialists here spoken of, those of the 19th century, Büchner, Vogt, Moleschott, all of them men who stood on the pinnacle of natural science, were capable of proving in the realm of philosophy more uninformed than the nakedest savage, then it follows not only that science has nothing in common with philosophy, but that the two are even hostile. Therefore we ought to go to the savages, not to civilize them, but even to learn philosophy from them. A Papuan or a Tierra del Fuegan delivering a lecture in philosophy to the professors of the Berlin University, Friedrich Paulsen for example, is a curious sight. I say to Friedrich Paulsen, and not to Büchner or Moleschott, because Paulsen is also an educated person, and therefore his philosophic sensibility may have suffered from contact with science, even if not so badly as that of the materialists. He needs the assistance of a red-skinned master. Why have German professors so little daring or enterprise? Why should not Paulsen, on his own initiative, go to Patagonia to perfect himself in philosophy, or at least send his pupils there and preach broadcast the new pilgrimage? And now, lo and behold, he has hatched an original and fertile idea, so he will stick in a corner with it, so that even if you wanted, you could not get a good look at it. The idea is important and weighty. Our philosophers would lose nothing by sitting at the feet of the savages. 116. From a History of Ethics. Doubts concerning the existence or the possibility of discovering a moral norm have, of course, I underline it, proved a stimulus to a new speculative establishing of ethics, just as the denial of the possibility of knowledge led to the discovery of the condition of knowledge. With this proposition the author does not play hide and seek, as Paulsen does with his. He places it in a conspicuous position, in a conspicuous section of his book, and accompanies it with a trumpeting herald, of course. But only one thing is clear, namely that the majority share the opinion of Professor Jodl, to whom the quoted words belong, so that the first assumption of ethics has as its foundation the consensus sapientium. It is enough. 117. The normative theory which has taken such hold in Germany and Russia bears the stamp of that free and easy self-assurance which characterizes the state of contentment, and which does not desire, even for the sake of theoretical perfection, to take into consideration the divided state of soul which usually accompanies discontent. Windelband, in Präluden, p. 313, is evidence of this. He exposes himself with the naive frankness almost of an irrational creature, and is not only unashamed, but even proud of his part. Philosophic research, he says, is possible only to those who are convinced that the norm of the universal imperative is supreme above individual activities, and that such a norm is discoverable. Not every witness will give evidence so honestly. It amounts to this, that philosophic research is not a search after truth, but a conspiracy amongst people who dethrone truth and exalt instead the all-binding norm. The task is truly ethical. Morality always was and always will be utilitarian and bullying. Its active principle is, he who is not with us is against us. 118. If, besides the reality which is evident to us, we were susceptible to another form of reality, chaotic, lawless, then this latter could not be the subject of thought. Real. Philosophie der Gegenwart. This is one of the a priori of critical philosophy, one of the unproved first assumptions, evidently. It is only an expression in other words of Windelband's assertion, quoted above, concerning the ethical basis of the law of causation. Thus the a priori of contemporary thought convince us more and more that Nietzsche's instinct was not at fault. The root of all our philosophies lies, not in our objective observations, but in the demands of our own heart, in the subjective moral will, and therefore science cannot be uprooted except we first destroy morality. 119. One of the lofty truisms: the philosopher conquers passion by perceiving it, the artist by bodying it forth. In German it sounds still more lofty, but does not for that reason approach any nearer to the truth. Der Philosoph überwindet die Leidenschaft, indem sie begreift. Der Künstler, indem sie darstellt. Windelband, Präludien, page 198. 120. The Germans always try to get at Allgemeingültigkeit. Well, if the problem of knowledge is to fathom all the depths of actual life, then experience, in so far as it repeats itself, is uninteresting, or at least has a limit of interest. It is necessary, however, to know what nobody yet knows, and therefore we must walk, not on the common road of Allgemeingültigkeit, but on new tracks which have never yet seen human feet. Thus morality, which lays down definite rules, and thereby guards life for a time from any surprise, exists only by convention, and in the end collapses before the non-moral surging up of individual human aspirations. Laws, all of them, have only a regulating value, and are necessary only to those who want rest and security. But the first and essential condition of life is lawlessness. Laws are a refreshing sleep. Lawlessness is creative activity. 121. A equals A. They say that logic does not need this postulate and could easily develop it by deduction. I think not. On the contrary, in my opinion, logic could not exist without this premise. Meanwhile, it has a purely empirical origin. In the realm of fact, A is always more or less equal to A, but it might be otherwise. The universe might be so constituted as to admit of the most fantastic metamorphoses. That which now equals A would successively equal B and then C, and so on. At present a stone remains long enough a stone, a plant, an animal an animal. But it might be that a stone changed into a plant before our eyes, and the plant into an animal. That there is nothing unthinkable in such a supposition is proved by the theory of evolution. This theory only puts centuries in place of seconds. So that in spite of the risk to which I expose myself from the admirers of the famous Epicurean system, I am compelled to repeat once more that anything you please may come from anything you please, that A may not equal A, and that consequently logic is dependent for its soundness on the empirically derived law of the unchangeableness of the external world. Admit the possibility of supernatural interference, and logic will lose that certitude and inevitability of its conclusions which at present is so attractive to us. 122. The effort to understand people, life, the universe, prevents us from getting to know them at all. Since to know and to understand are two concepts which are not only non-identical, but just the opposite of one another in meaning, in spite of their being in constant use as synonyms. We think we have understood a phenomenon if we have included it in a list of others, previously known to us, and, since all our mental aspiration reduces itself to understanding the universe, we refuse to know a great deal which will not adapt itself to the plane surface of the contemporary world conceptions. For instance, the Leibniz question put by Kant into the basis of the Critique of Reason: how can we know a thing outside us if it does not enter into us? It is non-understandable, that is, it does not agree with our notion of understanding. Hence it follows that it must be squeezed out of the field of view, which is exactly what Kant attempted to do. To us it seems, on the contrary, that in the interests of knowing we should sacrifice, and gladly, understanding, since understanding in any case is a secondary affair. Zu fragmentarisch ist Welt und Leben.